Hi, thank you. I appreciate the warm introduction and warm welcome. I am going to try to share information not only about incidents of bullying, but also about the strategies to address bullying. And I think I'm in a very lucky position at my university in that I have a policy and I was hired pursuant to that policy, the ACAF, excuse me if I'm going to give you numbers that mean nothing, but ACAF 1.80 is a policy that gives the definition of bullying and then gives the process for investigating bullying. So that is basically what I would like to go through. I would like to go through that process of bullying, a little bit about the investigation, and I'll explain to you why I think that's helpful. I find sometimes during the investigation, I actually engage in a little bit of a healing process, because at that point in a dispute, individuals are really quite contrary with one another, and it's really hard to have even honest, objective conversations with folks. They've lost all ability to be objective, and this is both the accused bully and the alleged victim of bullying. So I believe the investigation process is worth noting, just because I want to take you through how to do that in a way that maybe introduces the potential for healing and that also introduces a process. And then I'll go through some of the resources. When I do trainings on campus, what I've realized is at some level, we don't have the ability to respond to bullies in a meaningful way. We simply don't have the strategies. We don't have the authority. So we need to take a look at some other ways of helping our individuals. Here's again the policy definition of workplace bullying. And you see, if you're familiar with sort of legalistic language, this is what I would call somewhat legalistic language, a very high threshold. It has to be repeated, unwelcome, severe, pervasive, and intentionally threaten, intimidate, humiliate, or isolate the target. That is very difficult for an individual to show. And in fact, since I've been in my role for the past 3.5, maybe 4 years, I kind of lost track with COVID, if that was a year or 2 or 3. And I have only had one case that was found to be the complainant was found to be, the respondent was found to be guilty of bullying. So one out of, I've done over 17 investigations, and some of those investigations are quite involved and others are somewhat, able to be handled rather quickly. Bullying examples, just your basic things: verbal abuse, malicious criticism or gossip. The work interference and sabotage seems to be a highlight here at my university that happens with some regularity. So why does workplace bullying occur? I think we've noticed that sometimes these targets are identified for a variety of reasons, but it's really not related to the work itself. So typically, when you're going to find someone guilty of bullying, it's because they have perceived jealousy or unfairness or what you name it, that they're feeling another individual in their department is getting some favoritism or benefits that they're not getting. And so they take that opportunity, or more recognition, they take the opportunity to bully them in order to minimize that person. They don't usually want somebody to do their job better. Also, when you're investigating a complaint, these are the principles that I try to follow and adhere to as I'm investigating. I'm really looking at how do both sides perceive, and perception is pretty important here. How do both sides perceive this dispute to be a bullying or not a bullying issue? And then throughout the process, I'm really sympathetic with folks, because even when sometimes somebody comes to me and they share an incident that they believe is bullying, but it's rather clear to me early on that it's not going to meet the threshold, I'm still sympathetic, because I think when you've come to a random stranger on campus, there's a level of distraught, there's a level of hopelessness, helplessness that this person feels. So I'm sympathetic, but very careful with responses to recognize that I can see you're suffering. I can see this is a real concern of yours, but not saying, oh, this is a horrible situation. Clearly that this is unfair. Clearly you're being targeted. It's more just a sympathetic respect, not affirming that I know fully the whole story, but really listening to the perceptions of that individual who's come to make a formal complaint of bullying. Again, focusing on facts, not emotions, that's really helpful. I even say those exact words to individuals to try to manage expectations. I remind them I'm an objective party. I don't have any real awareness or knowledge firsthand of what is going on in your program or your department or your college that's led to this situation. So I'm going to have to be in this objective party that just listens, and then I'm going to fairly investigate and talk with all other involved parties, witnesses, and the person that you've alleged to be the bully. Again, that managing expectations reminds them, here's what the policy defines bullying as. Here's some limitations to me really fully knowing exactly what's going on. I can only use the evidence provided, just to take a little bit of emotion out of it. Then when I'm investigating, again, I go through these kind of fact downplaying, hearsay, encouraging the timeline, and sometimes checking and double checking timelines so that individuals are accurately portraying what they've experienced and what they believe trigger events are or the cause of the bullying. Above all, maintaining confidentiality and encouraging the parties to be confidential, keeping them informed so that I'm not further contributing to that sense of hopelessness or helpless status that they've been feeling. The records need to be very carefully maintained. And then above all, an open mind, but also thinking about observed behavior. What's going on? What am I observing? So keeping track of all that. I'll be honest, sometimes there's only so much I can do. And currently our policy is being examined because what we've discovered is I can make these recommendations and identify possible remedies to resolve the dispute, or at least provide some sense of solution or meaningful outcome for an investigation. But I haven't got the same level of authority that a dean might have in their department or their college, or a department chair might have. So what I do here is I just go through a series of opportunities, which I like to call them opportunities for addressing the harm that's been caused. And it might be mandated counseling. We have had a situation where somebody had an anger management, and so they were assigned by their dean to go through anger management. They threw a table at a colleague in a heat of a moment kind of incident. Certainly not acceptable behavior. And the party agreed to go to the counseling for anger management. Sometimes it's separation of parties. I've also had that where a couple of incidents where the individual's offices have simply been moved, so they don't have to suffer the regular torment of a colleague if that's in fact what's going on. And then the removal of privileges is something that also can happen. You're only going to be able to go to the lab at these times so as to avoid contact and avoid interference. Removal of titles, that's happened in one of my situations where somebody who was a program coordinator was removed from their program coordinator role in order to protect a staff member, or a faculty member who served under them in that program. So that removes some of that power differential, which is always a concern that I have when I'm doing an investigation, when one person has power over another individual. Finally, you could also deny access to research funds and or travel funds. Those aren't guaranteed in individual, unless they're guaranteed in an individual's contract. Where those things are not identified in a faculty member's contract, deans, department chairs have the flexibility to make those decisions. Dismissal recommendations are very rare indeed. I think right now our policy that we're trying to revise, we are hoping to have that as one of the possible outcomes specifically spelled out, because currently these issues are purely within the control of faculty shared governance processes, and that gives us little authority over incidents when they rise to the level of, maybe a dismissal is appropriate. So those are, I divided into remedies and recommendations, and I should explain that. Remedies are really ways of making whole the harm that was caused. And so you kind of try to remedy the situation. And that is, in essence, trying to make whole when there has been harm. Recommendations are a little more future oriented. So now we're thinking about what are trainings and interventions that could be introduced to try to stem some of these problems from even happening in the first place. Maybe recommendations are to get alternate resolution strategies in place, so that if there is a dispute, you already have those strategies, and you can say, hey, we've had a dispute. Here are the strategies that we've all adopted, or we've agreed will be another alternate way to resolve this, rather than having to go outside the department or outside the college. Mediation could be a similar thing that you might discuss. And again, I'm suggesting you talk about these things with faculty before you get to the point. So when I listened in on that conversation earlier, I probably should have jumped in, but my gut reaction was thinking, what if we just establish these, we know these situations occur, so what if we establish preemptively a mechanism to handle those situations when they occur? It takes the burden off of the student to have to now go out and seek a remedy for themselves. Rather, they simply report that, and then the group that has agreed, we're going to have alternate resolution strategies, or we're going to engage in mediation when certain things happen. They already have that mechanism in place, and so they're going to adhere to those policies or those procedures. Other things that I always recommend are targeted conversations. And again, I think the higher up, the better in terms of supervisors. I always call the deans of the colleges, and I tell them, I said, I'm coming into your house. So before I start an investigation, I want to know, what's your feedback on this? How involved do you feel you can be in the situation? How involved do you want to be in it? And will you, accept my recommendations at the end? And can we talk about those before I formalize them, so I can be sure you're comfortable? So I really do a lot of checking and a lot of giving power back to the people involved, but at the same time trying to drive what I've seen can be somewhat beneficial. And finally, professional development opportunities. We have a fantastic human resources department. Most institutions, larger ones, do have lots of support in terms of human resources. So it could be online training, it could be just having a professional come in. So those are some other things that I try with my remedies and recommendations. So then my next slide targets some of the things where I go and when I'm trying to extend. Now you've talked about remedies and recommendations, and now I'm trying to think what's proactively, what are the next steps that happen to have to happen, and getting really more specific in terms of resolution, getting in the outside party. I call the investigation intensive because I do believe that's a resolution in process. And I think I talked about that earlier. The way I write the report is also another way that I try to promote resolution. And so I'm writing the report in a way sometimes, and the deans often will call me later and we'll talk about it, and they'll say thank you because you got it all out there. Part of the problem with bullies is it's done in secret. And then all of a sudden, all the information is out there. And oftentimes, I really have trouble discerning who's the bully in a bullying complaint, because both parties look a little bit like they've just engaged in unprofessional conduct, and the lack of civility has led to this dispute where it's sometimes hard to tell who's the actual bully. So I use the investigation to just share and highlight when two folks are coming at something from very different perspectives. I give screenshots of what they complained about. So the complainant might say, I'm being bullied, and here's what my bully said, and this is why I think it's bullying. And then in response, the individual accused, the respondent might share their version of that story. Well, I give snippets of both of those so that you can see there's two people who allegedly had the same experience, but came away from it very differently. And they have to own that then, because it's in writing and it's memorialized in a report that we hold on to for 5 years in the provost's office. And then I make very clear at the end, should retaliation occur, should continued bullying occur, this report will be reopened, and all of the materials that I've collected are saved and on file in the provost's office. And that really helps. And the deans, kind of call me and they say, you know what, they needed to hear it from an outside, non-involved party that their behavior was not acceptable. And I will use those exact kind of language in my reports. I'll say, while this was not bullying as defined in our policy, this was a level of unprofessional conduct. This line of question, so example, somebody went into rapid fire, disruptive, somewhat hostile questioning during a meeting that, kind of overtook the meeting, and there was no way to even respond to this individual. It's not bullying but it is certainly something that's not professional. And what I write, like, specifically, and doesn't generate positive or collegial relationships when that questioning strategy is engaged in. So I call individuals out even when they're not actual bullies. And I oftentimes find that that's kind of starting the healing process, because they've had to own a little bit of their behavior, but also the person who's, claiming that they're a bully has to realize that, some behaviors aren't necessarily bullying. They're just, I don't like that person. Unfortunate behaviors. Let me go ahead and flip to the next screen. So what are some of the next steps? Because once you've done your kind of best effort to address bullying, to respond to specific situations or incidents where somebody has accused another of bullying, you now are left with how do I handle the after effects, and how do I handle an environment which does seem to be prone to these kind of behaviors, or unprofessional and lack of civility. So I talk through these 3 key areas: the managing emotions. I'll go into that in a little more detail. The nonviolent communication and compassion, and then the third one is thriving. And I talk through these with both parties involved: my individual who's complained of workplace bullying, and my individual who's been accused of bullying, because they're both in pain. A bully often is an individual who's in pain, and they're lashing out at somebody else, or they're feeling hopeless themselves, and so they're lashing out. I'm not excusing it, but I'm saying we need to heal both parties. So it's not always that there's a real obvious villain in these investigations. There's 2 individuals often who are just feeling harmed and needing some recovery. The managing emotions, I always say, beware of your wake. And I'm sorry, this is my attempt at humor. If you recall the scene from Caddyshack, when the big boat just literally, the wake devastates the small boat. And I think some level, that's some of what happens with bullies. Their wake is so strong that it's devastating those around them. And so trying to remind people, and when I'm asked and invited, and this is something that I think is a night of a preemptive, or when it feels like the culture is starting to get less than pleasant, or civility is lacking. Deans or programs or department chairs might call me in. I do this for an entire college, for example, several times. They'll call me in, and I'll go through these things and try to have people re-examine, how are you impacting others? What's your ownership in a situation? Some self-monitoring, a little bit of reflective practice, and above all, I think compassion for others. My caution is that you shouldn't be so restrictive of your own emotions that you engage in this thing called the emotional mask. If you've heard about the emotional mask, it's where you hide your feelings, and that can have also negative impacts on the individual who's hiding that they're hurt, or hiding that they're afraid, or hiding that they're feeling minimized or devalued by the bullying behavior another. That leads to this cognitive dissonance, and that's another source of burnout. So I know we're worried about bullying being a source of burnout, but having that bully sort of suffer in silence and mask their feelings, that then further compounds that feeling. So, I want people to understand that you don't have to hide yourself and how you're feeling when you self-monitor and engage in reflective practice, but rather you've got to try to think of ways to use that is still respectful and compassionate towards others. Scripts, I think, are useful tools, and we talk a lot about what would it look like to have a conversation with that person who you think is bullying you to get to the outcome that you want. We talk a lot about that also. What is the outcome that you would like, or that you foresee being a feasible one, or one that would resolve this problem? I know I'm in trouble when the person says that the other person has to get fired, because that's usually very difficult to pursue. And generally, it's been unsupported. And in fact, in virtually every single investigation I've ever done, there's never been impact or behavior that has been so disruptive or so damaging or so harmful that it would merit a dismissal of somebody. Yet I've gotten individuals who've told me, oh, I won't be happy until he is gone. I can't continue in this university if he's still employed here. And that very harsh communication style makes it difficult for a victim to ever feel like they're going to have a positive outcome, because that's the only outcome that they've come to as being feasible or reasonable or expected. Another aspect, this nonviolent communication, this comes from Marshall Rosenberg, and that's the name of the book, is Nonviolent Communication, A Language of Life. And I really found this to be a helpful strategy for individuals who perceive themselves to be a victim of bullying. And it was really a way for them to engage in a conversation that didn't also escalate their own reaction to the perceived bully's actions. So in essence, they were taking their responses and putting them in a very organized fashion. So restating what you did and not judging it, not saying, why are you such a jerk? But I'm wondering why you said that in the meeting and cut me off in that way. And next one, my feelings. I felt really minimized. I felt like my perspective wasn't valued. So again, instead of attack mode, which sometimes is our automatic response when we feel bullied, we want to counterattack. I ask individuals to think about this nonviolent communication style. Observe, name your feelings, and then what do you need instead? Like, hey, it really helped me if you'd let me finish my thought, and then maybe add your perception so that I understand why you needed to interrupt and add something differently, or I understand what you're needing out of our conversation or discussion in that meeting. And then finally, be very specific with your respects. What do you want from the other person? How would you prefer that they approach you when you're engaged in a dispute or a conversation? Again, this process improves the communication, because when we think about communication, it's not just, did you hear what I say? It's, did you listen? And then, am I listening? So the communication, for it to be meaningful, has to be less accusatory and more interactive and listening. So I talked a little bit about compassion, and Marshall Rosenberg also talks about this notion that we all are in a natural state of compassion. Biologically, there's some research that talks about what we feel like when we're acting out of compassion, how it's got positive effects on our brain chemistry. And so I'm always trying to think about this. How do you cultivate that compassionate form of communication? And it takes this notion of replacing the old patterns and stop assigning motives and simply think about, oh, I wonder why that's happening. Boy, I'm hoping they're okay. I'm thinking there's something, they're just not themselves, rather than the automatic, they're just a bully. They've always been a bully. They always will be a bully. Other things, those habitual responses and automatic reactions, trying to modify those, because we have the control over, we don't don't have control over the bully, but we'll have control over how we respond and how we let that bully affect us. I also talk about this notion that our perceptions become softened. So when we exercise compassion, our perceptions are a little softer about this other individual. And then instead of an angry reaction, we might be able to find what is our honest feeling and say that with a little more honesty and a little less accusatory tone. And finally, it doesn't mean that you have to sit and stand while a bully continues their egregious or unprofessional behavior towards you. It simply means that you're looking for ways that you maintain your humanity and don't let the bully's behavior counter that or take that away. This is this is just something for you. If you're interested later, you can watch the This Is Water. It was a commencement speech by David Foster Wallace. And I found his words to just be really motivating to me personally, to help me think about the constant judgments that we make about people around us when they engage in some behavior that we find unacceptable or unprofessional or bullying. It helps us stop and really think, I wonder if there's another reason why they're acting like that. Maybe I'm not going to give them the worst case scenario and assume the worst about that person. Maybe I'm going to choose to imagine they had a really rough night last night and they've just, lost their temper because of that. And I can't possibly understand it. But I'm going to explain to them what I need. I'm going to use my nonviolent communication, but I'm not going to label them in a way that minimizes them as well. The next slide is another strategy that I use. Sometimes I have junior scholars who come into my office and they simply do not believe they're in a place, even though the policy applies to all faculty and in all roles, whether that be a tenure track faculty member, a clinical, an instructor. All faculty at the university are covered by this policy. However, those junior faculty often are feeling a little intimidated by coming forward and claiming that a more senior colleague has attacked them. So my strategy to deal with those concerns, because they're usually not going to follow through with a bullying complaint or a formal investigation request, I talk about this notion of thriving. And the idea of thriving is how outside of this situation where the bully has seemingly attempted to take over your joy in your work or your joy in your workplace or your accomplishments, where else can you thrive that the bully simply cannot touch? They cannot interfere with your thriving. And that kind of fortifies individuals because they find that, wow, I can disassociate myself with some of those things that are going on at the workplace and find that I'm thriving outside the bully's control or outside the bully's domain. And that might include going to HR and signing up for a course and getting some new skills. Again, thriving effectively is a way really to promote you feeling healthy, because you can't control that bully. You can't control what's going on maybe in your office, but you can control how you feel and what you're doing to thrive and have healthy experiences and healthy outlets and feel engaged. And it's everything. And not that I'm a personal trainer or anything, but it's a recipe for thriving. It includes that nutrition, the sleep, the managing stress, the exercise, doing things that make you feel good. Those healthy activities and research has shown, can be sort of the antidotes to the negative effects of incivility. And then finally, we hear a lot about adopting mindfulness practices, and these enable you to process situations a little more slowly, because we do, I've been in this situation, and I think when we talk about people who work in this field, it's probably because we've been bullied. And so I also have been in the situation. That's why I applied for this job when it came open. And it was hard in the moment to practice that separation of myself from the situation, slowing down my breathing, slowing down my emotions so that I wasn't so impacted by somebody else's bad behavior. And so I'm still engaging in meaningful work. And then the last slide is just some resources. And then I I know I maybe sped through that. I felt I started a little late, but I want to definitely have a conversation and share any additional details or answer questions that anybody might have.